Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. This session, I will note, is being recorded, and it will be shared, and the slides, along with the answers to the questions that have been submitted, will be shared with you too. You're muted and will be so for the duration of the session. So, this morning's session, you will learn what to consider as your duties to your employees and stakeholders when you make the decision to reopen. Maybe you've already reopened, and you're making decisions rapidly at the moment. The provincial governments in Canada are slowly beginning to reopen the doors to the economy. But irrespective of government announcements, employers, you guys, will need to make your own decisions and determinations as to whether and when you will reopen your physical workplaces. Having a plan in place for reopening will be necessary to ensure a smooth transition back to work. In this webinar, we'll be talking about human resources related considerations in light of your plans to reopen, to gather questions and find solutions to this unprecedented time. Within the field of human resources, there have been, there are, and will continue to be unknowns. We accept that. What we do know is that the presenting partners of this session, that's the Collingwood Marketing and Business Development Department, the Centre for Business, the Business Improvement Area, downtown Collingwood, Georgian College's Henry Bernick Entrepreneurship Centre, and the Small Business Enterprise Centre are passionate about caring and creating an environment that provides our community's businesses with the greatest chance of success during these challenging times. We are moving along with uncertainty as the situation continues to evolve. However, moving along best we can is essential. And to that end, it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce our presenter for this morning, Maha Zaki, who has been an HR and business consultant for over 20 years. She's the founder of Console Coach, an HR consulting and project management company. Maha currently also teaches at Georgian College in the Human Resources Management program. Maha is also a strong believer that human capital is the single most important asset to a company of any size, but also realizes that humans are different and that no one size fits all, especially when it comes to engaging human resources, except, as Maha pointed out to me, in the case of compliance. Before I hand over to Maha, please feel free to use the chat box to submit your questions this morning as we work through the session. If we have time, we will answer them this morning. And if we don't have time, we will share the answers to your questions in the resource pack that will be shared with you as soon as we have access to it and it's ready, along with the video. So Maha, I'd now like to hand over to you. And again, thank you for partnering with us to deliver this session.
Good morning. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody, for joining this morning's learning process for all of us. The partnership we have with local businesses to support through this time is evolving and is ready as we need and as information becomes available, both on the provincial and the local level. We will be happy to share them. Today, we're going to start with kind of an overview of what we know today. We're going to go through some pre-opening considerations. If you're ready to open, if you've already opened, these are some of the considerations that we have to think through and plan for. We're going to be going through some best practices in terms of a planning process. It would be a lie to say that we have a best practice for any situation that is similar to this, but we have some best practices in terms of how to handle crisis in general or change to our processes and policies and people. So with this from that perspective, it would be sharing some best practices with some examples of how to go about doing them. We're going to go in and then take a look at a lean concept that's called PDCA, which is a plan, do, check, and act, which is an ongoing process that in general, we may have to adopt going forward because this is a long haul, not a short destination for everybody. We're then going to cover some of the questions that we received prior to the session as best as we can in an overall. Some of the questions we received may have been very, very particular to a workplace. I will handle these separately and I will reach out to these people. However, these are some of the questions that can probably be applicable to a lot of people out there. And in the end, we're going to go through the chat if there is time and see if there are any questions that we can answer. And like Tim mentioned, if we can answer them this morning, we will. If we can't, we're taking them back and including them in the package, and then we'll send out. So let's get started. To start, first things first, we have to build some clear objectives in this journey that we're embarking on for return to work. And a lot of the time, what we're seeing, both society, our general public, our customers, and our employees are excited and anxious at the same time. Some want to return back to work and go back to normal, and some are very scared and worried. So whatever decision you're making for your business, you have to keep some objectives clear in mind that will guide your decision making. Whatever you do, it has to be compliant. Anything that has to do with human resources at this stage is something we have not seen before. We don't know what is going to transpire in the future in terms of cases or grievances or issues. So making sure that you're doing your due diligence today is essential for the success of the gradual and steady return to work. Whatever you do has to pass what I like to call, has to pass the smell test. Is it transparent? Are you able to speak to the actions, the processes, the communication, the planning that you are doing for a safe return to work? And third, systemic and structured. Try to be as much as possible organized and setting the process so that you can backtrack. A lot of the time we're doing things with trial and error. And if you're doing too many things based on trial and error, it's very hard to go back and say when something didn't go well, why it didn't go well. So having a systemic, consistent, structured process to reopening, whether like we're going to see people process or policies, will help a lot in backtracking. If something is not going well, how can we fix it? And what was the cause for it? The essential piece we have to keep in mind that guides the business decisions is that this really has to be a gradual return to a new normal or a different normal, but it has to be gradual and steady. We're all in this together. Essentially, I'm encouraging that businesses, even competing ones, will have a lot to learn from each other by sharing what they're doing, what their thoughts are, who their suppliers, what challenges they have. So the more we have a good conversation among ourselves with our colleagues, competitors, and our support system, like the business center or other, the better we will all fare on the long term. So keeping some of these objectives in every decision you're about to make will help guide whether it's a go or no go. So what do we know what do we know right now? We know that we have essentially 3 different stages that Ontario is introducing for opening. And stage 2 is moving as early as this coming Friday. And this is not a one size fits all. There are some regions that are not going to be opening, and that could impact our local, where these regions will have some escape to our local regions. So we have to keep in mind that it's early, it's coming, and we have to realize we can only open if we're ready. And we'll speak about readiness in a minute. Before all of COVID, the health and safety in the workplace was an important legislated element, but it had some considerations to the size of the company. If you were a smaller size company or a smaller organization, was different in requirements than if you were medium or you were larger. What we were seeing is your duty to implement strong, robust, clear, and articulate health and safety in the workplace will become the new norm for everybody, regardless the size. This has impacted everybody. It did not leave out medium, smaller. It impacted everybody. So we know that we have a duty to provide a safe and healthy workplace. And right now, act as if you have to do the maximum, regardless to your size of organization. As long as you have employees, including yourself, that has to be in a workplace and serving the public, then put that in consideration. COVID-19 is considered a workplace hazard. So as an employer, you have a duty to make sure that you do a risk assessment. This is included as part of your obligation to provide a safe workplace for employees to return to. And when we say it's a workplace hazard, it also means that it may be covered by the Workers' Insurance Board in case an employee contracts it on the job. How that's going to be evidenced? The first is it's going to look at what kind of measures the employer has put in place to protect their employees. So the onus is always going to be on the employer to make sure that these parameters are in place. And I will share lots of resources at the end of the presentation and later on if you need, on how and where to look for your particular areas or for key starting points for making sure that regardless the size, you have a healthy and safe workplace for your employees to return to. The other thing that we know right now, this is kind of a list of opportunities and obligations, but there's an opportunity is that the emergency wage subsidy has been extended. So what does that mean to you is for a lot of you that have had to do a temporary layoff and are now recalling people, it is clear that you won't necessarily go back to recalling everybody from the get-go, or you won't necessarily be at the business capacity to actually have your employees back from the start. This allows you to bring back your employees and still apply for the wage subsidy so that you're sharing the burden and returning employees at a pace your business can take. It's a great opportunity to consider, but you have to consider it when you decide what kind of operations and your new norm is going to come back to. The other thing we know, which has just happened maybe last week, is the extension of the infectious disease emergency leave. What that means to you, the law, Employment Standard Act say that you can temporarily lay off employees for a maximum of 13 weeks in a certain period of time. after which that you owe them, you have to make a decision whether you're recalling them or you're permanently laying them off. If you do lay them off, you owe them a statutory severance package. And when we come to statutory or severance package pay that you have to pay, this can make or break a small business. Not a lot of organizations, given how slow or non-existing business was in the last 3 months, would be able to do that. So there's an opportunity that was created by the government to allow that if you can't recall them, you don't have to bear the burden of the layoff if you can't call them all back. So there are two different opportunities you would have to see how to use depending on your particular situation. Important to note that when you're starting back to work, the human rights had a law that you and employer have a duty to accommodate people under protected grounds. One of these is health conditions, medical conditions, family care. And right now, this still stands. You still have a duty to accommodate, whether if you had employees that were on some pre-COVID accommodation plans, you have to refresh them and review them and draft them and see how that would work in the new norm. Or at time of recall, if you have employees that say, I declare that they do need accommodation, you still have the duty to do that. And the duty to accommodate in the eye of the law is you have to accommodate up to the point where you're not taking undue hardship. And undue hardship in common law and statutorily means basically unless you're going to go bankrupt. So you have a lot of room to have to accommodate, and it's a case by case, but it has to be taken into consideration when you start to open business. Whatever you do in terms of processes and policies and new procedures, privacy has to continue to be at the forefront, whether your customer privacy, if you're going to be implementing some tracing and data collection, phone numbers, emails, time of service, whatever that is. And for your employees, if you're going to be doing any health checks, have to continue to be very, very sensitive information that has to remain private. Let's talk a little bit about some pre-opening considerations. We'll break it into 3 key buckets: policy, process and procedures, and people. If you keep the buckets very clear, it will help you narrow down what you need to do. Your policy really tackles what you need to change, what you need to do, what you need to do differently or update. Your process and your procedure is your how. How are you going to actually put that into action in a way that manages your operational costs, manages the change, and can be considered as real due diligence down the road. And the third bucket is for your people. People are really the ones that are going to implement any of these. Without your people having a policy and procedure in place, if it's not adopted and absorbed and applicable, it won't necessarily pick up. Don't underestimate that. So some of the policy considerations: if you never had a health, safety and health policy in place, written, in the past because it wasn't mandated of you because of your size, now is the time to develop one. If you did, it needs to be revised to include infectious diseases, COVID, contingency planning, and the new regulation around PPE. You need to consider attendance and remote work. How are you going to deal with attendance in relation to or not in relation to COVID? And how are you going to make sure what criteria you will use if you will continue to allow people to work remotely if it's possible? You need to put together, even if the regulations that are set out by sector, which the government has announced and shared and has given resources on, you need to embed it and include it within your written processes and your written policies. Some of the things you need to consider is, are you going to be creating new policies when you look at your new operation model? Like, are you going to be allowing shift trading, whatever? Are you not going to be allowing it? Are you going to be changing, asking employees to change their clothes before coming into the workplace, changing? These are all policies that need to be written and they need to be clarified. Even if historically they were there, they need to be updated, redated, and retrained on. And before you start any of your pre-opening, how are you going to plan for your recall? How are you going to document? A lot of the companies, smaller businesses I have spoken to at the time did not actually do layoffs in writing. Did layoffs as in, okay, we're shutting down business, we can't continue to operate, and we're going to put you on ROE and you go claim your EI or CRB. So with the recall, unless you have very clear processes and very clear clauses in contracts, if you have contracts, you need to document and state exactly how your recall process is going to go. Some of these policies may exist before, like a sick leaves policy. And how are you going to do that now differently? How are you going to make sure that employees openly tell you and share with you if they've been exposed so that they can take a sick leave without being penalized? How are you going to create a policy to ensure there's talk now that there is a guarantee of a 10-day sick days policy that is being enacted, yet to be seen, but internally, if you never had something in place, now is the time to start putting some criteria around it. Historically, the law did not allow us to request detailed diagnosis, detailed medical notes, detailed, so we need to create a policy around sickness where we would encourage employees to speak in confidence and to share, but at the same time without violating the rights to the privacy. Prior to opening, you may want to have a self-identification process. You may want to build some kind of pre-return to work survey for anybody who, has been in contact, has been out and about, has been at risk of some sort, does know anybody or has been in contact. You may want to get consent on some self-identification that will help you possibly in how you organize your return to work employees. Next, we'll move to the how, the processes, the procedures, your working. How are you going to implement all of this? How are you going to communicate? Communication is going to be key to consistency, to updates, to staying in touch. And if historically it was a phone call or a morning check-in in the office or in retail environment, or Now it has to have some more documentation element, and it has to be consistent. So where employees should expect to see formal updates and communication is going to be through email, virtual meetings that they have to sign off on attendance, notice boards on site. How are you going to make sure that the communication is consistent, cascaded, and available to everybody? Your work process. How is your workspace going to accommodate social distancing, hygiene? Are you going to count how many people are in the capacity of the store or the office? Are you going to keep a log? Are you going to do some kind of tracing using a phone application of some sort? Then you need some consent. How you are going to actually operate the application of these thinking has to be thought and processed pre-opening. Ideally, you would take your current operational procedures and do what we call a stop, start, continue matrix. What needs to stop because it's risky, what needs to start happening, and what we can continue doing even if with slight changes. Once you start returning back to work, your employees by law have the right to refuse work that is unsafe. But how will they voice that concern, and to who? Because you would have a duty to investigate it and to make sure that it's in place. And there's no room that this can be missed, that somebody would say, I'm not feeling comfortable doing this work, and nothing happens about it. That's not due diligence. That will not work well down the road. So what is the mechanism by which employees can voice their concerns, and to who, and clarify what the next steps are going to be? How are you going to educate your customers and manage their expectations? We know we're not going to be all coming back at full capacity. We're going as we need. We're going to go gradual and steady, and we're seeing customers too have expectations. And if we had no harassment to employees policy in the past, it may be required to be reminded and refreshed again to educate your customers on how to deal with your employees, what their expectations are when they are on your premise, and if they have a concern, where they would give that concern to you. We don't want to lose that opportunity. Where are you going to get your personal protective equipment? And where are you going to, how often are you going to replenish it? How can people use it? There's a lot of misunderstanding around, how you wear a mask, or whether you should be wearing a glove or not. So based on your industry or your sector, there are some key guidelines, but how you actually implement that, how often you order, where you're going to order from, and how you're going to use the supplies, and whether employees can provide their own if they want or not, has to be part of your process and procedures. The last bucket that you have to consider prior to opening are your people in terms of the behavioral change. It's taken a lot of people, a couple of months at least, to get into new habits, and they're coming back and you are asking them to change a lot of what they're used to doing. So how you retrain them, how much time you give them to get their mindset into coming back to work. Some of them are very, very stressed about returning to work. Some of them are super excited to come back and maybe too relaxed. Managing the behavioral change is going to be probably the biggest reinforcement. Policies, processes, and procedures, the references are endless. There's a lot of ideas. There are checklists. Again, there's going to be a reference list at the end of this that you can utilize and use. But your people are really the ones that are going to apply all of that. And their behavior will be the biggest factor in making this a successful transition to a new norm. Some of them may require more one-on-one engagement and communication on how they've been doing and where their mental health is and how they're handling the change and what their expectations are. And continuous communication and rebuilding the trust that they can operate in a safe place will be a key challenge for a lot of organizations. Not that the intention is not there, but because of the mixture of information and guidance we've been getting, there's a lot of confusion. So internally, you want to rebuild your consistent communication and be a source of a pillar for where to go, and also to be open to receiving feedback. So if we were to look at the pre-opening key considerations, bucket them into what policies you need to consider, processes and procedures, to how you're going to actually apply them, and your team, how you're going to communicate, train, retrain, remind, and impact behavior. Remember, the easing of the restrictions means you can open, but only if you're ready, only if you're feeling that your guiding principles that we discussed in the beginning, like that it's compliant, that you've done your due diligence, that it's transparent and you can speak to it and explain it consistently and openly, that it's gradual and structured, should you actually open again. Back to some of the best practices. So we've talked about what you need to consider, but a lot of the organization, the smaller companies I have talked with, because the team size is reasonable, a lot of the policies were based on, you know, we've talked about it before, or we've put a flyer, or we've put a poster. Right now, you really have to do more diligent documentation. When you do a policy, the best practice is keep it simple, keep it easy to understand, make sure that everybody can read the language and not have any double interpretation. If you have to run it by 2 or 3 of your friends that have nothing to do with the business and they understand it, that's a good measure. It has to be dated so that we know when it requires an update or when it was last, the relevance of it. And it doesn't matter if you have a complete folder of practices and policies, and if you don't share them and make them available, it's useless. When you're building a policy, it has to be applicable. It can't contradict, and we've seen that, and sadly, some organizations where you would say, you know, for you to apply to a vacation, you need to give, you know, a week's notice. But the manager can respond no later than 2 hours before the start of the vacation time. Like, that's not applicable. It contradicts a working procedure. It contradicts logic. Whatever you do in a policy, it should be use a language where what behavior do you want people to follow using this policy? What's the objective of making this policy not just a verbal email, a verbal call or an email? It has to drive a behavior that you want. It should not ever be fear-based. If you don't do this, you're gonna get fired. If you don't do this, it should always be a logical, applicable policy that would speak to a logical and reasonable person in the process of their work. A policy is meant to be consistently applied. If we apply it once and twice, and it does require an update and amendment, that's fine. It's not engraved in stone. It is something that can be updated and amended, but that's why you have to keep it dated and shared so that everybody is aware. A policy at this stage of COVID, especially if it has to do with the health and safety aspect of it, has to be signed off. It is a good practice to have a record that you've trained, people understand it, and that they've signed off on it. So policy has to be something that drives action in a way that is clear, understandable, and while applied consistently is something that develops with the business. Some best practices on developing your processes and your procedures. Again, document it. Create a pre-opening team so that they can help you develop your actual process. If you do a walkabout in your work area and you define the risk and one person can look at it, but you're not necessarily the person doing the work. You may have 2 or 3 high-rise, great performing team members, forward thinkers, outspoken, that you can build based on their input as a pre-opening team. What should you consider? Engage them in building a new process or a new procedure. They may know the work better than you, the operational side of it better than you as a business owner. It also builds credibility that you have engaged those that know the job. When you build a procedure or a process, the best is to have it visual, to have PowerPoint, for example, has some amazing, simple visual where you can build a process. Build your process. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, do that. And make it with prompts, make it visual, and make it very clear that anybody that can come back into work, we say that people need a refresher on their work duties after they've been off work for 3 months, if they have been off sick, for example. Consider this as a refresher. So anybody who can come back into a job can just get back into a routine by following these steps. Ensure you have some closed loop in place, which is a feedback mechanism. And when people start applying these new procedures on the job, they may have great suggestions. When I'm doing this way, it is not necessarily generating the result that you want. It's taking too long. It's risky for others. Whatever the feedback you get, create a way by which they can give you that feedback. It could be a daily check-in with the team at the end of a shift. It could be an email, which is part of what you need to think of where people make suggestions. It could be just a folder where people just leave their notes in there and you can flip through at the end of a shift. Whatever that is, make sure you take it seriously. You won't get the feedback if people don't trust that you're going to act on it. And with this trust that you're going to act on it, you will hear a lot of tips and resources and ideas on how you can create a safe workplace. And that's what you need. The processes, again, need to be dated, revised often, and durable so that you can post them in all visible places, whether at the workstation, washrooms, shared areas, whatever that is. Don't assume that people necessarily remember or know, or that common sense is what the norm. train, retrain, and have the team sign off. And training doesn't have to be anything. Like you don't have to rent a hall and have people sit there and do the training. Have your, and then keeping a social distance, have people come, have a conversation, share the documentation, gather questions, have a trial run, and sign off. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to be consistent and clear. People best practices. When you're recalling people, you have to be very clear when they're expected to come to work, what should they expect when they come to work, and what has been done to ensure the safety measures are in place. Make sure that this is documented. If you have a refusal for return to work, it has to be very clear why. Have that conversation and make it in writing. If there are any changes to hours, schedules, be open and transparent. People are creatures of habit. Help them build a new work habits for safety. Like we said, training, policy, and procedures. If employees come back and they don't feel safe, you must investigate and remove whatever safety precaution hazard that is there. If you disagree, let's say that an employee says they don't feel safe to work on this job, it's not whatever, you do the investigation and they still refuse to return to work, one of you can call the Ministry of Labor, where you will have somebody come on site and actually assess the risks and help you figure out, and that will be binding whatever decision it is set. And you can't penalize an employee for going through that process. It's a legal right, and that's why we're saying do all of that ahead of opening. Do your risk assessment, involve different people, and have a plan in place. People are reacting differently to this. Some are excited, we said, some are not. Treat everyone with compassion and equity. And when I say equity, I mean in terms of, if you're going to be flexible, you have to be flexible with everybody. And you have to listen to everybody and get their cases. You cannot discriminate based on, how old they are, if they're more risky, what their pre-COVID performance was. Now is not the time. All of this is really an ongoing process. It's using a lean methodology, continuous improvement. We're not going to a destination. We're not going to jump from where we are today to where we were pre-COVID overnight. It's a continuous cycle of planning, doing, checking, and acting on it. It's called the PDCA cycle. Create your team, assess the risk, document, process, review your physical space, your H&R, your health and safety policy, your new business norm, what your recall plans, what your PPE suppliers are going to be and how often, where. Do act on these pre-plans, recall, retain, and sign off on training. Communicate early, often, and clear. Engage customers and employees in what you're doing about your health and safety measures. Continue to look at your decisions based on the principles you set at the beginning: compliant, transparent, systemic, and can be applied, sustainable for a gradual return. Track. It has to be daily if you need to. What's working? What's not? What happened every day? What incidents were there? what your inventory is. It's a due diligence daily cycle until you get some steady line of sight. If you see from your check that there are things that need to be acted on, act quick. Don't hesitate, act quick. If you see there's a risk, act on it. Continue doing this plan, do, check, act cycle on regular basis. Have a second eye. Follow, create a plan B. What happens if we see a spike again? What happens if you have to shut down again because of infection? One thing I encourage you all is, as a business owner, you are managing the business, managing the operations. Consider building a second line. Consider building some operational team lead within your business that can help you get this going. Remember to sharpen your saw. You're going to be overwhelmed because it's overwhelming, because this is a difficult time for everybody. Recharge, regroup with other people like-minded, rest. And the forecast is that we're not going back to a new normal before, a 12 to 18 month study. So this is a long, take your breath, resharpen, and continue to. So here are some of the questions that we have received prior. When can I start recalling employees? So you can't start recalling people before you've done some your due diligence. Your health and safety assessment, your PPE is in place, you're forecasting who you're going to be recalling and why. If not, you're not recalling them. And as soon as you're ready with these some basic pieces we talked about in the pre-planning, you can start recalling your employees. Again, depending on what we're seeing with the regional opening plans. So one other question that we received is, how should I do the recalls? Like, do I have to go by seniority? Do I have to go by? So in a non-unionized environment, no, you don't have to go by seniority. You take a look at your business operations and you see if you have, some key jobs, some key positions that need to be filled first. You can recall these based on your operational need. Ideally though, you also look at when your 13 weeks are going to be up. If you're recalling the oldest, the first laid off or not, and time yourself and what that means in terms of whether you're going to go back to using the CEWS and the time it takes to apply for it, and or putting people on an infectious disease leave. Give them as much notice as possible. Give them a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, because people need to get back to a new normal, make arrangements for, whether it's transportation, childcare, is there anybody else in the family? And the process has to be documented. You have to find a way by which, whether it's email or registered mail, that you say clearly what your recall information should look like. And if they have within 48 hours to respond to the recall. What if an employee refuses to return to work? That is a question we're getting a lot. So there are different reasons why employees may refuse to come back to work. The most prominent we're seeing is they're worried about their safety. And while they have the right to refuse work that is not safe, they first have to come back and actually see if work is safe or not. And that's why we say in your recall, list what safety measures there are, what has changed to provide reassurance and to make sure you're transparent with the changes you have made. If they return and they don't feel safe still, you investigate. If you investigate and you adjust and remove the risks, and they still don't want, you can both, either one of you can call the Ministry of Leave and have an independent assessment done. They don't want to return to work because they are at risk of some sort. They have a medical condition, or they have a family situation, or these have to be dealt with first in writing, what it is that is required and why they're not returning, and showing compassion and understanding and what can you do. Remember, you have an obligation to accommodate if it is based on a medical condition that compromises them, that puts them at risk, that if they are living with somebody, they're caregivers for somebody who is at risk, or if they are the primary care providers for children, schools haven't opened yet or won't open at all. So they can't have any other arrangements. And you have to create reasonable accommodation, change shift times, allow them to continue to work from home, even to the point where you're changing their job so that they're able to return to work. The third could be they don't want to return to work because they're making more money on CRB. Okay, CRB is offering $2,000 a month. If you have anybody where you can return in a full-time job and they're making less than minimum wage, then yeah, they're probably not going to return. So you need to consider if you're actually somehow your pay structure is motivating to that. But they can't refuse return to work because they're making more money elsewhere. That would be considered abandoning their job. And it has to be documented in writing that they're refusing to come to work. Do I have to recall all employees? No, you don't have to recall all employees. Ideally, yes, you will eventually, using the different measures and opportunities that exist, like the CEWS, that you can stagger, return people on a gradual schedule and eventually recall everyone. Or you do your forecast, there's no way you're going to go back to peak capacity, and either you put them on, you change them to a infectious disease leave of absence, change the ROE, and they can be eligible to EI, or you realize that this is going to be permanent layoff because you're having a complete reduction in your workforce, and that's it. You don't foresee that this is going to change. And that has to be handled very, very carefully if you do, because you can't lay off somebody permanently and then rehire somebody else in their position without getting a little gray there. So no, you don't have to, but you have to do your due diligence into who you're recalling, why you're recalling, and what are you going to do about those that cannot be recalled for the time being. So if you do decide to terminate permanently, and you say, you know, I'm just going to pay the severance, I can afford it, I'm never going to return that or refill that position, not in the foreseeable future, due to restructure or due to a new operating model, you have to get some consultation from an employment lawyer. Because while the Employment Standards Act tells you what is the minimum statutory pay you have, the common law looks at other factors. It looks at, you know, the age of the person, how employable they are, how long they've been with you, not just the time, but the specific value they've brought in. So you might need to consult with an employment lawyer if you do decide to do a permanent termination, to make sure that your severance payment are not violating not just stat, but common law. How should accommodation around health issues should be handled? It should be handled very carefully. It's a protected right under the human rights. They have to request the accommodation. It has to be declared if you're recalling them and they say they require accommodation. And it is, if you have allowed in an office environment, for example, somebody to have been working from home the last couple of months, and now you're asking them to come back to the office and they say they can't because of health risk, it will be very hard for you to evidence that they can't continue doing their work from home if you've already allowed it the last 2-3 months. So it has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, cannot be dismissed, and it requires that you have a private conversation with the person and documenting the issues and building an accommodation plan based on that. Remember, again, it can go as long as it's undue hardship, meaning you're not going to go bankrupt to accommodate, you have a duty to accommodate. What if I have done my due diligence, I've done my health and safety risk assessment, I've updated my policy, I've trained everybody, all PPA is available, and then I have an employee that's just not following it. They're not taking it seriously, they're not getting they're doing an infraction, they're risking others. The first step is you're dealing with this like any other performance issue. You stop it, you have a conversation with that person, you remind them of the policy that they have been trained on and signed off on, you give them a warning, and you escalate if you have to. So it is, you can discipline somebody because they're not following a safety and a safety rule that could jeopardize others. I'm gonna take a look at.
I've got a couple of questions in here, Maha, that we can probably address right now. So one was, is the wage subsidy for all employees, both hourly and salaried? And then a follow-on from that is how would that relate to a refusal to coming back to work if an hourly employee was receiving more from the subsidy than they would be from work?
Yeah, the wage subsidy doesn't differentiate hourly or salaried. It has other criteria for the employer himself in terms of revenue loss. I'm going to share that as one of the links at the end of the presentation for references to so that you can refer to that from the government's website in detail.
Excellent, thanks. A couple of the questions in the chat have been covered by, I think, the answers that you've given. There was one here. So there was a question about, well, we need to create a health and safety policy. Do you have any recommendations for templates to start from?
I'm going to share also a link to, there are two parts to that. The Ontario Safety and Health Act has some even free training on their website and some guidelines on policies and some templates. But also the Ontario government has created a guideline by sector, which is a fantastic resource. So like if you're in the hospitality sector, if you're in restaurant business, if you're in, you know, whatever, here are some of the things that you need to consider when you're building your policy. So yes, there are some resources out there that you can start from. I'll add them to the link at the end of the, I'll add them to the resources.
That's fantastic.
So
and I think
just take a note of that. Verses 4.
I think now would be a good time then just to show that resource list that we'll be sharing with everybody through the share of the slide deck.
Yep, I'm going to share the resources slide right now. There's a question from Shane, though. I don't know if I've covered it. If someone doesn't feel comfortable coming back to work yet, despite our safety protective steps taken, then we are not permitted to terminate. So if first they have to come back to work first to see that the steps are, they need to actually say, this is what's not working for me. I'm not feeling safe because so-and-so. You do your investigation and your evidence that, you know, you found no risk or you've adjusted to that precaution. If you disagree on both, you can engage a third party from a Ministry of Labor, and the Ministry of Labor said that they're manning up their field officers because they expect a lot of that happening. They're going to expect a lot of that happening. If the person refuses to come to work in the first place, not even checking that there's a safety, you can give them a notice that they're abandoning the job because they have not actually come into work to check that these measures are within safe and compliant. Does that answer the question? Okay.
I think we would have to wait for him to respond in the chat.
Okay, so let's look at some of these, some of the resources. So for those within the South Georgian Bay, and you need further one-on-one or a specific case, or you need help with tackling a particular area in relation to human resources or how to return safely or any of these, you can get consultation, contact him, Newton, and he will refer you to that. It's covered. The Employment Standards Act link, you need to get that. In one of our previous webinars, we covered that one of the first things as a business owner you need to know is have that reference available to you. You don't need to memorize it at all, but you need to know where it is and how to check it. Ministry of Labor has the Health and Safety website, and they've specifically put the Ontario resources to prevent COVID in the workplace. The human rights, the protection, and there is a section particularly on COVID and how to make sure that there are, how to deal with the privacy and how to deal with accommodation in light of COVID and what to be careful. Remember, we have not seen any of these people issues escalate to a court of law in relation to COVID yet. So the onus is always going to be on making sure you're doing your due diligence and that you are guiding your work and your decisions by fairness and consistency and documentation. So make sure that you do that. And when we come to, if I hope not, there may be some, you know, you've built your case in whatever you're doing. The Human Resources Professional Association has also offered to the public some COVID resources, and it has a combination of, you know, some legal articles, some, it's a good resource to keep an eye on. PricewaterhouseCoopers are gigantic consultants, one of the top 5 consulting agency companies, and they've put a quick PDF checklist like on, you know, reboot or return to work. And there's a link there for it. And a lawyer company, that's a resource for questions to ask for risk to ensure a successful return to work. The Canadian Society for Health and Safety has put a free mental health course package that you can use online. I'm going to add some resources to specific templates for policies and resources regarding health and safety and PPE as well.
Maha, thank you so much for sharing all of that information. You really took us to a granular level, and thanks for using relevant, pertinent, and suitable examples to expand on your points. This is a question I know the answer to, but for the benefit of those watching, if our companies in our region have additional questions, can they reach out to you, and are you providing answers following this session?
I really appreciate everybody that's taken the time to attend today. I can't stress enough how this is a collective learning. So if you attend a webinar and you ask an open question, share it. If you get an answer and if you get an idea, share it. We're all trying to get to a new norm with the least risk, both for our families and for our employees and for our customers. And there's right now, there's no black and white. The only factors will be, have you done your due diligence? Have you thought this through? Have you documented it and traced it? Really, these are the key factors that I would continue to stress.
And sorry, Maha, just in terms of follow-up, are you available for questions?
Absolutely.
That's great. So those questions can be channeled through the Small Business Enterprise Center office. Please feel free to reach out to us and we can put you in touch with Maha, who we have on our team during this interesting time. So that concludes our session today. Maha, again, thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom, and best of luck to everybody that's out there in business. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the video as well as the slide deck and the answers to your questions in text format. Hang in there, together we'll get through this. Take care and have a fantastic week, guys. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you. One last thing before we go. The amount of information out there is overwhelming. Every subject matter expert, reference, resource, follow the buckets. What are the key policies? What are the key processes? How does it relate to my people? Because it can get overwhelming fast, and that's not what you want. And good luck with reopening. I can't wait to come back to a new normal, but it has to be slow. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Maha.